Nonprofit Institute, and I welcome you to this presentation, Leadership Resilience in a Time of Turbulence. As you're well aware, in this particular moment, we're having a really good morning. I'm Zachary Green. In terms of this leadership resilience in a time of turbulence, as you well know, we're facing two major issues at the same time. One is the pandemic and the virus that is present in the world, and then the other is the issues of social justice related to race. In this time of turbulence, it really invites us to think about how we are going to be able to stay resilient in the face of all of that. So our exploration today will involve a number of things concurrently. Number one, what are the real issues around resilience in this time of turbulence? And what we're going to do is we're going to look at that from a variety of different directions. So with that, let's begin our journey into this, and we'll go to the first slide to talk about that. So one of the ways that I've been thinking about this recently is the quote that you see to the top right there. How are we to treat others? And think about that question. How are we to treat others? And then if you answer the question in the way that is invited by Ramana Maharshi is, there are no others. So if we think about ourselves as one rather than the other, then we are able to deal with a time of turbulence, an opportunity for transformation, and the path to resilience. So let's go on to talk about where our journey is going to take us in the next slide. What we have here is that there's a context that we're in right now of the global pandemic and the protests for racial justice that are going on not only in this country, but around the world. There's a way of understanding this in terms of a conceptual framework known as VUCA. There's also a way of understanding this in terms of trauma-informed care. Then we're going to do a deeper dive into what we mean around resilience, the notion of post-traumatic growth as a way of providing health and wellness for us all, and then ultimately what we mean by leadership resilience. So let's begin to look at this a little bit further. With our next slide, what we have here is that Viktor Frankl, as many of you may know, was a survivor of the Holocaust. And what he did is he began to examine what was it that allowed people to be able to survive such a horrific human circumstance. And then what he noticed was, and this quote is just exemplar of that, is that when we are now no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. So what we have here is the idea of the personal aspect of the resilience. But what we're also going to be looking at is that in addition to that, how do we begin to think about these at a global or a systemic level? So let's look at this in terms of the first concept that I mentioned, which is VUCA. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see that living in a VUCA world, and you say, well, what do you mean by VUCA? Well, we're going to be talking about resilience amid the turbulent transformation that the Earth is experiencing right now, both from the pandemic and from the social unrest. So let's talk about how VUCA came into being. What do we mean even by this concept? So on the next slide, we'll get a sense of the history of that. VUCA is not a new term. It's actually been around for almost 30 years, but it really came into deeper meaning after the 9/11 attacks. So what happened was our biologists in the 90s were saying, in the post-Cold War era, what are we going to see here? What is going on? Is conflict in the world going to be the same, or is it going to be somehow different? And what they developed was this idea, well, there's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And well, what does that mean? Well, after the 9/11 attacks, we recognized that VUCA is a very real thing. And then the concept was extended during the 2008 financial crisis. And now in the pair of issues that we're dealing with in the pandemic and the global unrest, we see VUCA. He says, but you keep using this term VUCA, VUCA, VUCA. Well, what are you really talking about? So let's go to the next slide and let's begin to see. VUCA simply stands for and is an acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And so what we're talking about is that anytime we see these major upheavals of one form or another, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity tend to be present. There are two axes of this. There's one is how much do we know that you see at the bottom. And then the other part that you see is how can we predict, how we're going to, the results that are going to be in this circumstance. So at the top right, you see that the volatility is that's the rate and pace at which things are happening. And volatile also really means exactly what it sounds. It literally creates situations that have unexpected challenges that could be explosive in its nature. Down at the bottom right in the blue, what you see is the uncertainty, is that there are things that we don't know. And the magical thing about uncertainty is that we know that we don't know them. And then in the face of the change, we don't understand how all these things are going to come together. In terms of ambiguity, there are too many things that are unknown, and there's no real way to pull those together in such a way that we can really be focused. And then finally is the notion of our decision factors. And what we mean by that in terms of complexity is that there are a number of things that are going concurrently into a situation that just makes it even difficult to know how to start. So I imagine for all of you right now that there is some question about this whole notion of VUCA. And so let's go to the next slide and just ask yourself the question. Right now, from your perspective, which VUCA condition is most present? And then you have the capacity to do chat here. And so it would be really important to have a sense from you. What do you think is most present? Is it volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity? So just take a moment and put in the chat what it is that you think. For many of us, this moment is characterized by uncertainty. While there is a great deal of volatility, as evidenced by the events on the streets in almost any major city in this country, as well as what we're seeing around the world, we're also seeing the nature that there is a complexity in terms of how these events have become to be understood. And there is a great deal of ambiguity about how we're going to put them together in a different kind of way to create our shared future. But this also then has elevated, both in terms of the disproportional outcomes that we have seen in terms of certain groups for the pandemic, as well as what we are seeing today in terms of the world, where generational and historical traumas are being brought together. And so all of these issues are going on at the same time. So in a recent article in Scientific American, it says, trauma shakes up our world and forces us to take another look at our cherished goals and dreams. We tend to rely on a particular set of beliefs and assumptions about the benevolence and controllability of the world, and traumatic events typically shatter that worldview as we become shaken from our ordinary perceptions and are left to rebuild ourselves and our world. Some people right now are experiencing this moment as a representation of trauma. And for many, the pandemic is a shared trauma that we've gone through. And so we're going to look at then, what do we mean by trauma? Because we're trying to find our way to be resilient in the face of this. So the next slide asks us simply that question. What is trauma? Von der Kolk and Fizzler are like the scholars on this, and they talk about it as an inescapably stressful event that overwhelms people's existing coping mechanisms. So for some of us early in the pandemic, we had that sort of experience, is that how we cope with this kind of panic and anxiety that we felt was a part of this idea of a trauma. But there are deeper and other ways to talk about this as well. And so I'd like to give you another definition that may make the idea of trauma even more clear. So let's take the next definition, which is trauma is the unique individual experience of an event or enduring conditions rather, in which the individual's ability to integrate their emotional experience is overwhelmed in such a way that we're talking about the ability to stay present, understand what is happening, integrate the feelings, and make sense of the experience, or the individual's experience, your own subjective experience. It feels like a threat to life, body integrity, or sanity. This gives far many more specific conditions to trauma. And I would ask those of you who are listening to consider, in what ways do you see trauma, even soft, temporary trauma, to be a part of the experience that you've had in the last 10 to 12 weeks? As we go on to that, let's look at some of the symptom patterns that are true in trauma. These include the sort of notion of shock, flashbacks, denial, strained relationships. I've had a few of those in this time. Anxiety, sleeplessness. Perhaps you've experienced some of that. I have, for certain. Physical symptoms, headaches, nausea are just a few examples. And then the unpredictable nature of the emotions, where I over-respond to things in a way that typically pre-pandemic would not be something that would even bother me. But right now, they begin to show up. And then rumination, the thought over and over and over again about things. Perhaps you've experienced some of the variety of these ways that trauma shows up, and you would not be alone. So let's continue and to begin to look at the different ways that this manifests itself. Because what we know is that in the situation that 70% of adults in general have some experience of trauma, I mean, that's 70%. So that means 7 out of 10 people walking down the street have experienced some form of trauma. And then what we also know is that of that 70%, 20% go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, these numbers that I give you next, 90% of healthcare workers, that was before the pandemic, that 90% of healthcare workers experience trauma. And it's not always direct trauma, but it's a notion called vicarious trauma that I will be talking about a little bit later. But let's look at certain groups, refugees and asylum seekers, 100%. But what we're beginning to learn by the unrest on the streets is that other populations also carry around another notion of trauma. And we're going to be talking about that in more detail in a moment. So let's go on to talk about what we mean. What we want all of us to understand is that there is not just one trauma, but there are different ways to think about trauma. And these are personal, vicarious, collective, and historical. Personal trauma is the kind that you would have directly. Let's say that car accident that you had, or perhaps you were a survivor of a sexual assault. Some of you may be refugees from a different country and therefore have lived through horrific experiences. These are actual personal experiences of trauma that you carry with you. And in my own life, there are moments that I carry with me that represent personal trauma. But vicarious trauma is slightly different from that. It isn't that you directly experience it, but you witness it. Part of what is going on in the world right now is that for 8 minutes and 43 seconds, there are many of us who experienced a vicarious trauma that we are carrying with us. It wasn't us directly, but it's a representation of us. And therefore, we powerfully feel all of those anxiety, sleeplessness, rumination that I alluded to earlier as a part of a trauma that we now carry. Collective trauma is what we all experience through the pandemic. I don't know about you. I'm older than probably most of the people that are witnessing this moment of this webinar. But what I am saying is that is something that we all now carry in us, in our bodies, as a shared experience. Even if we were not directly affected by the virus, we have been carrying around the collective experience of the virus. And now the next one I want to talk about in two forms. Historical trauma has two pieces of it. One part of it is the historical experiences. So, for example, as people of the United States of a certain age, the 2008 financial crisis was traumatic for a number of families, and a lot of people really had hardship during that time. Then there are of a certain age where then there was the 9/11 attacks. That would be an example of a historical trauma. And then other people who lived through the assassinations of Martin Luther King, of Robert Kennedy, of Malcolm X, of John F. Kennedy, of the whole period of the 1960s in many ways. Those are historical moments of trauma that people carry with them. Now that's one level of historical trauma that are a part of the stories that are related to people's identity. But there are also other elements of historical trauma which are basically generational trauma, meaning that my personal trauma may be actually not just mine, but my parents, and my parents' parents, and my parents' parents. And so the way that gets conveyed over time is through me, and through it gets embodied in me. So let's look at the next slide, because then we have quite a situation. Because intersectional trauma is exactly that. It is the intersection where you are right at the center of it. And so if we were to do this as a sort of more interactive session, what we would find out right now is that each of us have either witnessed or experienced some combination of these four. I can speak to how personal, vicarious, collective, and historical trauma are true for me. I would imagine each of you has some variant of these that you can also speak to. And what has created this moment right now is that we have many people who have experienced personal trauma related to the vicarious witnessing of trauma that is a part of a collective experience in the pandemic that has historical antecedents. So this turbulent moment that we're in right now is a reflection of how the intersection of these all come together. All right, now let's go on. Wow. Okay, so how do we manage this? Well, we don't, because the nature of trauma is this. It's an inability to manage the uncertainty. So we talked about VUCA before: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Here we are in this situation, and then our ability to manage this uncertainty is the nature of the trauma, is the nature of the thing itself. The other part is that we increasingly have these sort of unfiltered thoughts and behaviors. That's a fancy way of saying that there's a part of ourselves that we try to contain and hold in abeyance. And what really begins to happen now is that this becomes so unfiltered, so uncontained, that it breaks through. And it creates complexities in our relationships, and complexities indeed in terms of our relationship to ourselves. We begin to use unhealthier psychological defenses. There are an abundance of psychological defenses that we all carry around. And then among those is the idea of denial, which is it doesn't exist, and projection, which means it's your fault, because I don't want to deal with it in myself. These kinds of things begin to happen as a function of trauma, and it tends to be much more the case when we are experiencing multiplicity, or the intersectional trauma. And then what we begin to have in addition to that is this ruminative process where the intrusive nature of things begins to hit us really, really, really hard. And then that becomes what I call the substance of shadow, which is a very fancy way of saying this, that you and I know that inside of us there are things that we prefer people not know. and things that we prefer not to deal with because we like to have them under covers, pushed away, pushed down. What trauma does, especially intersectional trauma, it lifts all of those things up so they're right in the middle of it. So the collective trauma, the personal trauma, the vicarious trauma, the historical trauma, with its historical antecedents, and in addition to that, with the intergenerational aspects of those, come together and they lead to explosive turbulence. Make sense? Okay. How are you doing so far? I imagine that that's a lot to take in already, but we're only halfway through the journey in terms of just talking about this. Because what we want to do is get to a point where you have a moment to think about it yourselves. So let's take it to the next level, because I want to talk about these ways that the trauma shows up. Think about yourself in the last 10 weeks during the lockdown and things of that sort. Now think about yourself in the last 2 weeks as the turbulence has begun to show up in terms of social action. Think about all of that at the same time. It is likely, very likely, that in that time you have gone through all 4 of the pathways that let us know that intersectional trauma is present. So what I want you to see is that there's a next slide that's kind of prettier that sort of speaks to that. Because this isn't just like one thing, it's a nested process. By nested, that's a fancy way of saying that not one is happening, but it's all together, and even graphically this is insufficient because there's an actually interweaving of all of these elements at the same time. So let's do the basic. Here you are in the center. Think about yourself. At some point, what we want to know is that to what degree do you have this sort of rejection? What do you mean by that? Well, I don't want to deal with this. Rejection is basically denial. It's not happening. I don't want to deal with it happening. I'm not there. The next part is then the idea of repression. Well, what's repression? Repression is exactly that. Repression is really pushing it down, pressing it down so that we don't experience it. We don't want to feel it because it's way too much to feel. The next one is slightly healthier than the repression because rejection, it doesn't exist, or we want to blame it on somebody else. Repression, we want to say, is I don't want to deal with the fact that it's there. And then regression. And regression is simply pushing it out of our consciousness by doing something else. Regression is on a healthy level, that ice cream cone that you just ate yesterday because you just can't deal with things. But the regression shows up in other kinds of ways, where old behaviors that we thought that were gone begin to show up again. So what we're really getting to here is that the rejection, repression, regression are normal ways to deal with the trauma. But what happens is that on a collective level, if we participate in this, then what begins to happen is the kind of unrest that we see. If that others that we look around us are rejecting certain realities in terms of other people's experiences, in terms of their collective or historical trauma, then what we have is this battle between the rejection and the repression, and then it leads to the regressions that we experience, where old behaviors show up. What we are inviting people to is the level and depth of reflection. What I mean by that is that, are you able to, in the face of intersectional trauma, reflect on that? And are you able to have empathy for the experience of others who are experiencing generational historical trauma, who have a different experience of vicarious trauma? When they learn of a person who has been in her bed and then the police have gone to the wrong home, and then she is left dead. These kinds of experiences that people are trying to speak to invite us to recognize that we cannot be in the rejection mode or the denial mode, because even if we don't want to deal with it, even if we want to repress it, the regression is not sufficient as a defense against it. So it invites us to the deeper, broader level of reflection. Whew. That's a lot to deal with, I know. But that's what this moment is about in many, many ways. Now let's go to the next slide. Okay, so in the face of the current moment, we're really inviting each of us to think about how do we even recover from this, and what do we mean in terms of recovery from trauma and oppression. Why are you putting those two things together? Well, it is a day-to-day practice for some that they are dealing with experiences of oppression and systematic racism and things of that sort. That's what's being called out today. But in addition to that, we all have the experience of the pandemic. So whether you want to hear what I'm saying only in terms of the pandemic and sort of bouncing back from that, that's totally fine. But what I want you to know is that right next to that is the experience of oppression that people are also speaking to. And these two things are both being expressed at the same time. So let's talk about how we even deal with resilience and what that really represents. So a definition of resilience is like this. It is that resilience can be defined as the ability to adapt well and bounce back after facing adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant stress. And so what you have here is that in the face of these circumstances is that how well can you bounce back? Right now, I live in a neighborhood where people are acting as if the masks have come off. People are going, the distancing is disappearing, because there's a wish to believe that we can just bounce back, just in terms of the pandemic. There are others who are saying that, wait a minute, not only do we have the pandemic, we have other traumas and tragedies, and I'm not quite ready just to bounce back. I'm ready to deal with these in a different kind of way. So we have the tension between these two elements concurrently. So, well, we know what it is, but then how do we deal with this? So let's begin to talk about how do we deal with this. So the capacity to manage the everyday stress of life while staying healthy, adapting, and learning from setbacks to prepare proactively for future challenges. So resilience, if you hear that, it has two parts of it. There's obviously a part that's about me, all about me. We're going to work with this as if it's all about us as individuals. But in addition to that, please hear, to prepare proactively for future challenges. So there are future challenges that we're faced now, right now, in the present. And how we're going to cope with those, how we're going to deal with those, are fundamental to how we go forward, not only as individuals and as a society. So we're going to work with this in terms of resilience, and we're going to invite you to begin to think about, how do you do this? So let's go on to think about it a little bit further, please. So look at each of these resilience factors: authenticity, purpose, adaptability, self-care, support, energy, and networks. Think about each of those. Authenticity, purpose, adaptability, self-care, support, energy, and networks. I would imagine that on some level you believe that these are present for you. So just take a moment and look at this before we go on. Just to look to see which of these, okay, I have these factors. And then I'm going to go more deeply into what each of those really represent. So before I go into them, just take a moment. Okay, so I'm going to go through each of these and then let's just begin to explore. When we talk about authenticity, we're talking about the practice of it. I mean, to actually live into it in a very specific way. As you can read on the slide yourself, it means knowing and holding onto your personal values. It really means deploying your strengths and having a good level of emotional awareness and regulation. So I ask you to think, how much are you living into that authenticity? The next one, finding your calling. This is the call to purpose. Having work that offers purpose and a sense of belonging. Aligning work with your core values and beliefs. So again, many of us are in the nonprofit sector because by virtue of being at this academy, that means that perhaps that's there. But even within this time, it is for you to begin to see and to think about how much is purpose driving you. And then the next part is maintaining perspective, adaptability, staying optimistic and keeping a solution focus when things go wrong, reframing setbacks, and minimizing the impact and negativity around you. So again, let's just look at these three. And if you feel comfortable doing it, I would like to hear from some of you. Which of these three do you believe that you already have as strengths, already have as capacities? Authenticity, purpose, adaptability. Now let's go on to the next three. Sorry, next two. Next two are about mastering stress. I don't know about you, but during this pandemic, one of the real challenges has been self-care. You know, I do meditate. I try to pay attention to what I'm doing. I also want to, do my daily walk. But sometimes I'm not like that proverbial plant that is shown here. Sometimes it's difficult for me to break through and difficult to find my way into and with what we see here. And so what we have is that the idea of this is that having work and life routines that help you manage your everyday stressors. That means working to create this sort of work-life balance, and work and life have been balanced together, often in the same home with the same people for 7 to 10 weeks. And so how we then manage the self-care in the face of that is what this question is. The next part is about support, and that means interacting cooperatively. And if we go back to the previous slide, I'm sorry, seeking feedback and offering advice and providing support. So this isn't just about me and what's going on with me, but it is also about how we are functioning together, how we work together, and how that flow is created. Now we can go to the next slide. Thank you. And so the energy, so we talked about self-care, but in addition to self-care, what we're talking about is the real ability to stay healthy. And what do I mean by that? It is by maintaining sort of like the fitness that is necessary, having a healthy diet, getting adequate sleep. That's what we mean by energy. And then the last part is networks. And what I mean by that is not only just like that personal and professional support aspect of it, but how these are interwoven in such a way that we really perform well. So if we go back to that original list, and we don't have to do it on the slide, I'll just go with it, is the idea of authenticity, purpose, adaptability, self-care, support, energy, and networks. Which of those do you have? Which of those do you already possess? And I'm going to give you a minute to reflect on it. If you're uncomfortable putting it in the chat, that's totally fine, because there are lots of people out there, and I understand that this is sort of a private thing. But I would ask you to think about which of the factors, again, authenticity, purpose, adaptability, self-care, support, energy, and networks do you have? Because that's the beginning of your resilience, these factors. Okay. So privately, if you're working on your resilience factors, now it's time to begin to do some work on the actual resilience itself. Let's go to the next slide. The actual resilience itself is the biggest challenge, because what we know here is that resilience is a wonderful thing, but how common is it? Well, in reality, when we face these traumatic events, we want things to be relatively stable, and we want to have good psychological and physical functioning. And so, as it turns out, resilience is actually more common. The data are beginning to point in that direction. And it isn't simply like the psychopathology. It is not. As a matter of fact, it's the absence of psychopathology. And so it can be maintained in multiple ways. So what we're talking about here is that everyone here, regardless of the range of the kinds of trauma that you may be experiencing, you also have this ability to bounce back, this resilience. And George Bonanno here really helps us to understand that we have this ability to adapt and deal with and confront disruptions. We have it. And so, how do we go about doing that? Well, let's think about it first. And I want to give you a visual metaphor that may help as a way of doing that. And the next slide sort of speaks to that. Have you ever heard of kintsugi? It's a wonderful thing. I could read the slide, but I would prefer just to talk about it. So let's say you broke your favorite mug or piece of pottery or something like that. You would feel like it's ruined, perhaps, and most of us would just throw it away. Well, kintsugi invites us to gather all the broken pieces, all of the broken pieces, and then begin to glue them back together, but not just glue them back together, but to find this, something really precious like gold or silver or platinum, and put that in the plaster. And then as we glue it back together, then we have something absolutely stunningly beautiful, which is different from the original wholeness of the form. But what we have is evidence of the brokenness, but the evidence of the brokenness now whole again in this beautiful way. There's a lot of brokenness in the world right now, and people are trying to feel whole again, but they have not been given the opportunity to find that gold and platinum to pull together in a way that they can feel like all the cracks are filled in, and so that whatever was precious can hold the weight of what the world is presenting right now. That's part of what's happening in the world. Part. And so if we think about this concept of kintsugi, then what are the ways in which each of us is broken? And in what ways are each of us confronting situations and circumstances that are difficult, in which we are not able to hold our broken history? Resilience is an invitation to find those places and spaces, but not by ourselves, again, in terms of those 7 factors that we alluded to just a moment ago. Now let's take it to the next level, please. Post-traumatic growth. Whoa, what do you mean by, I know about post-traumatic stress, but what do you mean by post-traumatic growth? That seems like inconsistent with what we've been talking about. Well, you see that I've been using two metaphors, at least visually. One is that plant that breaks through the concrete, and then the other one is the notion of our brokenness that comes together, as you can see here, to create something quite beautiful. Post-traumatic growth is precisely the same way as then how do we work from our personal brokenness, and then how do we extrapolate that out to the brokenness of our society to begin to find different ways to begin to bring about change. So let's begin to move into this. Post-traumatic growth has many different elements of it, but first we need to talk about the nature of adversity. And the first one is that our ability to appreciate life, our ability to really have a greater appreciation of what strengthens us, is through relationships, through compassion and altruism, through an identification of new possibilities or purpose in life. As you can see, the growth from adversity has a lot of similarities to the kinds of things that we talked about in terms of the resilience factors. It's the idea that we really have to grow in our awareness and in our strengths. But this list adds another component. It has an enhanced spiritual development. That doesn't mean about going to church and things like that. It means a sort of an orientation to a deeper source to which we're all connected. It is about the interconnectivity of all of us. And it is about some sense that on a relative scale in the cosmos, how minuscule we really are. And so how do we then grow into that? How do we find creative ways of expressing that and who we are and how we are in the world? So let's begin to talk about what this really means. Because post-traumatic growth, in terms of the next slide that we'll see here, is really not something yet you would actually want. As a matter of fact, the research indicates quite the opposite. Though we can see our bowl there is absolutely beautiful, stunningly beautiful, in some ways even more beautiful than its original form, most people, and I think all of you would agree, would prefer not to have the trauma. I would say that that's probably true for all of us. I prefer not to have the traumas in my life. And then the other part of it is that growth from positive events is sustained longer. What do you mean by that? What it means is that if I have a series of positive events that give me the same lesson, I can sustain that learning longer than the trauma, because there's a part of me, because of trauma, that remains constantly vigilant of the possibility of that trauma over and over and over again. And so it doesn't work as long as a consequence of that. And resilience and adaptation are needed to transform adversity. In other words, the resilience that we talked about a little bit earlier, the 7 factors that are there, you need to be able to do those in some combinations. Then you need to adapt them, shift them, and then you can transform it. So it's a step-by-step process. It isn't like, oh, well, I have a trauma and now I'm resilient. No, we have to translate it. And then trauma, once triggered, is often subject to morph and return. Well, what does that mean? Everybody knows what's going on in the world right now. The reason that these things sort of morph and return is because they remind us of previous periods. Just a few years ago, there were a number of people who were killed unarmed. And we had the conversations that we're having now, then. And for other people, this has been a historical, generational pattern for years and years and years. And so the trauma then morphs, and then it's difficult to be resilient in the face of the repetitive patterns of things without any real structural or systemic changes. That's at the societal level. On the individual level, we look at our own behavior and we recognize that for some period of time we can sustain proactive and healthy behavior. But then at the next moment, then we find ourselves once more falling prey to our same patterns. So there are some key considerations here that we need to begin to integrate. In order for us to have a resilience orientation, and I'm inviting everybody to begin to shift into how I need to do this, me personally, is to identify the immediate stressors. So I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I wouldn't do myself. So my immediate stressors include what is going on around me. While I am speaking to you right now, there's a crisis going on in one of the organizations that I'm a part of. The recent events has led to media exposure of folks, led to really virulent attacks on a few of my colleagues, and really has caused the whole network to be just absolutely, I don't know, let's use the word that we're talking about, in a turbulent situation. That's just the immediate. Also in terms of that, I have a child who's trying to finish homeschooling in this kind of virtual environment. Now, that may not seem like something, but right now he's trying to get online to get to class while I'm online with you, and we're trying to make sure that there's enough bandwidth so that both of us can do what we're doing. Now, that may seem like a minor thing, but it's real, and it's a stressor, like right now. In addition to that, I'm trying to sort of balance the interests of the various professional places and spaces that I'm in. And then I'm trying to deal with me as a person and where I stand with all of what is going on and what is my role in it and what's my purpose in it and how much is something like this even a contribution to it, and is there a way that I should be using my time to really affect a change differently. These are stressors that I am feeling. You have your form of that. In the nonprofit sector, that may be the work that you're doing, but it could also be the quality and the nature of your ability to bring the purpose to your mission forward at this particular time. Okay, got that? Now, the next part of this is the inventory of strengths. How are you currently coping? What is the mode of coping with this moment? Let's go back. I'm not done with that one yet. Let's go back. Okay, so the current coping, this sort of like positive attitude, so that we can really begin to select potential routes and then begin to engage in healthier practices that promote this wholeness and healing. So to talk about the stressors is where a lot of us get stuck. We just talk about the stressors. Then we don't do the next part, which is to begin to talk about, okay, what do I have to deal with this? And then from there, how do we begin to develop a course of action? And then how do we begin to have healthier practices to go with it? Now we go to the next slide because we have a nice little 3-step. Okay. Resilience factors have many, many, many elements to it. But what I want us to talk about is a 3-step process, and then you can see how you put your ear to this. Ear is exactly what it sounds like. Engage, assess, and renew. So if we were face to face, what I would really do right now is just sort of pause for a long time and ask you to do this part. And so I am going to pause a little bit in this sort of moment and ask you to think about what are the strengths that you have. So the previous slide asked you to identify the stressors. But now I'm going to ask you to talk about what are your strengths. What are you bringing to this situation that will allow you to cope better? This means that you do have things that you do. For example, in my own case, I have a meditation practice that used to be really strong. But in this time of pandemic, rather than increasing it, it dramatically decreased because of the number of other stressors that I was feeling. For you, it might be that you are a runner, or it could be that you're a writer, or it could be that you're a cook, or it could be that you're really good at providing support for others. Whatever it may be, what are those strengths? So I want you to take literally 30 seconds to a minute to think about what's a strength that you have. Continue to think about that. Notice the rumination, notice the thoughts, notice the rejection that we talked about earlier. Notice the repression that's pushing it away. Noticing the distraction that is keeping you from attending fully at this moment. Please try to engage your strengths right now. Okay. The next part is assess. So once you begin to engage the strengths, then the next part is to assess your progress. This is to determine the gap between what you want to do and where you are right now. So in a similar way, I'm going to ask you to spend 30 seconds to a minute really assessing where you are right now. And what I mean by that is to really determine within yourself, where are you right now and where do you want to be? And so for me, in terms of my meditation practice, it used to be 30 minutes a day every day. It's been a while since it's been 30 minutes every day. And so how do I even begin to do that again? And so that's the first step. The next part is then, what is the gap? So if that's where I am, okay, so I do 10 minutes a day, then how do I get it back up to 30? And so that's the gap that I'm trying to manage. And so for each of you, 30 seconds. Think about what the gap is that you have and how you want to address it. A few more seconds. Okay. And then the last one here is renew. And what do we mean by renew? Renew is your resilience. That is being able to discern whether there is actual renewal. So in terms of your respective practices, if you've identified your strengths, if you've identified the gaps in terms of the assessment, then it's about this being something that you begin to live into. So again, another 15 to 30 seconds this time. Because it's hard to talk about renewal if you haven't done the engagement and the assessment, but let's think about it anyway. What is it that you may need to repeat in terms of a practice over and over again until you're really living into your resilience? Okay, let's give that 15 seconds of thought. Okay, thank you. Now let's begin to get to this other part here. Ultimately, what we want to get to is the idea of a piece that we're calling, next slide please, leadership resilience. And so if you weren't able to come up with anything, I did some work for you. The research indicates that there is the idea that our rumination doesn't have to be the kind that keeps us up at night, but there can be this thing called deliberate rumination. And deliberate rumination is our way of setting intentions for where we want things to go. These are about positive changes in relationships. This is about perceptions of new possibilities. So, what would be an intention that you want to set for yourself right now? And these intentions can be personal, but these intentions can also be in the broader context of the societal transformation that is going on right now. Another way is expressive writing. That's been one that's really helped me both in the pandemic and in the current moment, is to begin to find a way to put into language how I deal with this traumatic situation. And that way the range of feelings that are in me then have a place and a space to be said, to be understood, to be noticed, and to be worked with. And then your answer. There are ways that you have of working with this moment that are clear and powerful and present. And so these are just two examples. Perhaps you can find others. And then one thing that really works well is what is called a 10-word intention, is to try to put what is going on right now with you in this moment into a future kind of trajectory so that you can begin to put that in just 10 words. Another way of doing this is called a 6-word memoir. Either methodology does the same thing. It's just finding 10 words that helps you express this. So I didn't do one for this one, so let me think. Get myself ready to deal with the world to come. There we go. Get myself ready for the world to come. Okay, there we go. Got it? Got it. Okay, let's continue. Okay. Now, this all leads to this notion of leadership resilience. Leadership resilience is that it's not just about me. It's also about the teams that I work with. It's the groups that I work with. It's the cause that I care about. And how do we get to a place and space to be able to do that as well? So what I want us to think about, because we're nonprofit professionals, is facilitating and sustaining our teams, the virtual teams that we have. But beyond the virtual teams, that these are practices that are absolutely key beyond the virtual space. So let's begin to examine those. So the next slide will give us the beginning of that. So when we talk about our teams, there are certain factors that facilitate what we're going to do. And so you need to think about where you're going to focus. So on teams, what often happens, especially in virtual space, but as we begin to return to offices, things are not going to be a return to normal. We want to say that they're going to be a return to normal, but in reality, they're not. What we have to deal with is that there's a level of confidence in our abilities that we would each need. And so I invite you to think, how much do I have confidence right now in my ability to deal with my own resilience, as well as the resilience that I need to face what's going on in the world right now? What is it in terms of disciplined routines around our work? What do you mean by disciplined routines? You said that I just need to live into purpose. No, it's not that alone. When we have a team, there's also a way that we need to work collectively in terms of a really sort of a disciplined stance and a disciplined way of working that allows for that work to be focused. And then each of us needs to figure out our respective balance of our social support, our family support. We need all of that at the same time. So how do I develop more confidence? How do I develop the routines around my work? And how do I make sure that I have the supports around me? So these factors facilitate not only for me, but for our teams. And so part of an exercise that you can do, and I would invite you to do it, is, and I've done this with actually 3 of the teams I work with, is to begin to work just these 3 questions of what it is that we need to work on in terms of facilitating factors. Okay? Now the next part, in terms of building our teams and doing this leadership resilience is to begin to look at what are the sustaining factors. And the next slide speaks to those sustaining factors. So the sustaining factors are, next slide please, thank you. Okay, so I will tell you, thank you. The sustaining factors are, which one of these do you need to enhance? So you, in terms of a leadership role, have a deep responsibility to begin to work with what we're dealing with. How much compassion are you, as a leader, exhibiting right now? Are you exhibiting care first? And what I mean by care first is that, is the emphasis on the care of our common humanity, or is your focus elsewhere? So you're saying, but wait a minute, there's all this work that didn't get done in the last 10 weeks. We have to make sure we're on task and budget. Yes, I'm not saying that we don't deal with the day-to-day elements of this, but what I am saying is that this compassion can go along with it and it costs nothing to really show care and concern for one another. The next part is to make accommodations. Now, in addition to the legal ones that we're working with, what we want is for each of us to think about during these turbulent times, that what is it that we need to accommodate for people's health situations, mental health situations, and economic circumstances, just to name a few, that will need to be attended to differently in this period. And then, how are you guiding the conversation? What do you mean by that? In certain workplaces, people are holding meetings as if this is just another workday. What I'm inviting all of us to think about, and it's absolutely critical to do that, is that, are you being the voice that is inviting people to a courageous conversation about this particular moment? How people have responded to and have been dealing with the pandemic, and how people have been dealing with the prospect of what it means to really deal with racial justice right now. All of these factors are going on at the same time. And so whether you feel skilled about it or not, it is important to at least make the conversation available, because everyone is walking around with some degree of how this is impacting them, going from the extremes of trauma that is historical and generational in nature to the immediate of what it has been like to cope with this pandemic. Now, that was a lot. So what I would like you to each do is to think about, okay, what is my plan for my resilience? Where are my steps in terms of these factors, in terms of resilience? And I would imagine that each of you can choose one of these. So again, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about it. Displaying compassion, making accommodations, and guiding conversations. Which of these are ones that you want to develop and cultivate in terms of your leadership for resilience? Okay. Now, our final pieces here. So we've been on a journey. Our journey has taken us in a variety of directions. We have looked at the nature of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We expanded looking at those to tie those into definitions and expressions of what we mean about resilience. That ability to bounce back in the face of adversity, and to be able to not only bounce back, but be ready to deal with those circumstances that create those kinds of things. We then looked at the nature of trauma, the trauma that we recognize is present in almost all adults. 7 out of 10 of us carry around some degree of trauma. but then also that there are what we call intersectional elements of trauma that are personal, that are collective, that are generational in nature and historical in nature and vicarious. Then we began to look at this notion of post-traumatic growth, and post-traumatic growth expressing how do we indeed put together some factors that allow us to live with greater purpose, authenticity, and capacity to bring about change. And now what we've been looking at in this final step has been leadership resilience. And what we mean by that is our ability to display compassion, make accommodations, and guide conversations so that we, in a much more disciplined way, focus our work and focus that work in the context of making sure that we have those social and emotional factors that make a difference in our world. So a way of closing, what we're going to do is we're going to look once more at our colleague and our scholar, Viktor Frankl. And so the next slide says, those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. We're in a moment of pandemic. We're in a moment of turbulence. We're in a moment of potential transformation. I would invite each of you to think about what is your why in this particular time. And if you can find that why, then how you can be resilient and how you can bring leadership resilience to this particular moment. And so then that leads to the how. And this particular workshop has been about some ways to engage that, assess that, renew that, so that you can begin to find a pathway for yourself and beyond that's filled with compassion and care for others, as well as care and compassion for yourself that allows you to move this forward. So take a moment now to think about your why, your purpose, what it is that you're bringing forward. And with that, we're going to look one step deeper to really speak to this moment in our final slide, where it says, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. So in terms of the why of the Viktor Frankl period during World War II and the Holocaust, where are the places where our lives begin to end right now because we're choosing to be silent? So resilience has within it an invitation to move beyond the silence into the substance of this day. So with that, I want to thank you. If there is any comment that you have that you would like me to address or any question that you have, I'd like to hear that. I can be on for a few more minutes, and I really appreciate your attention. And let's go find our resilience in these turbulent times. Thank you. Thank you. That's true. There are times when compassion can be presented in such a way that it isn't compassion. Compassion really is, by definition, a feeling with the other that recognizes their need and their feeling. And if it is done in a way that is not, then it is not kindness. I really appreciate that. Thank you for raising that point. Thank you, Daniel. Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. I hope it has offered something. Really appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you for calling out what I was naming. I appreciate that as well. Yes. If our compassion is born out of relief of suffering, it's a very different thing than one that is out of my own selfish need, self-interest, to appear to be concerned and appear to be empathic. Thank you for really deepening that point. Yes, one of the ways that I talk about this often is that if we can begin with ourself, and that one slide that I had about you, is that some of this work has to begin with ourselves. I think a lot of you know that young people on TikTok are using these brief videos to challenge the attitudes of their families during these times. And those relationships are then being exposed in such a way that the attitudes are being confronted in a generational way like never before. These kinds of conversations were not visible in the late 60s when these kinds of eruptions were present in my household. And so it is really important in terms of the broader world how these things emerge. Well, the whole idea of this particular workshop is to feel as if there are elements that I have within me, strengths and capacities that I already have, that I can bring forward. And if any of you really feel like you have just one piece, then it makes it easier to go forward, because it is a time that's beating us all down. And if we aren't able to find enough of the resilience, it's hard to do that next step. I think all of the professions are really being challenged right now to begin to think about how it is that we go forward. I'm a psychologist by training, and so it is really important for me to see that we are able to work from non-traditional ways of beyond our individual consultations to really recognize that we have a contribution to make beyond one-on-one therapy or group therapy. And I think social work as a profession also has something to offer in that respect as well. I like that idea. One of the slides that I had, and I didn't emphasize it enough, is how we can begin to use artistic expression as a way of helping people to really see what's going on and how we can learn from the experience of this moment. I really thank you for adding that as well. Well, thank you. I hope it was useful. Okay. So thank you very much for your time and attention again. Let's go be resilient. Let's go face the world. We have a lot of work to do. It's only just begun. Okay, thank you.